كبيرة وهائلة، وربما هذا ما أشار له المسؤولون العسكريون.
The United States is in a state of confusion and surprise.
We fear this. We fear that they have something out that majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı. Ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. Get a lot of killers. Why you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone sicks me on. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Hello and welcome to Varn Blog Solo Shorts. And today we're going to talk about lies, damn lies, and your siloed statistics, or what may be called misuses of polling and misuses of local anecdote. Now, a theme of this show has been that you must forget that your immediate feedback loops actually tell you the truth about the political realities of the world or the political opinions of your nation or even your community. One thing that has come up over and over again, you can read, actually you can listen to Fight Like an Animal podcast, and I will put the link in the show notes here on a lot of things I mentioned today. For the idea of epistemic diversity, even amongst areas where policy notes or even beliefs or surrounding cultures are actually very, very consistent, meaning that people's explanations for their beliefs and what's driving their beliefs is often not actually accurate, and the superficial policy instructions that come from a region's alignment to a particular politics often come from things that are not actually obvious. Meaning that, as for the example in the Fight Like an Animal podcast's discussion of this, you could go to hill country up in the mountains of California and meet a bunch of people who seemingly have libertarian values, but their reasons for having those values, be they hippie commune concerns about growing your own weed, to paranoia about the government, to relative isolation from the socializing effects of cities, etc., are different in each person, but the policy consistency would be the same if you were to poll them on what they immediately wanted. Which tells you two things. One, this is kind of the old Marxist canard about ideology, but people's ideology is often actually highly individuated. It's individual. You might believe all kinds of reasons for why you believe something that are not directly related to what you actually believe. And two, this makes polling and all the things around polling somewhat misleading. We've been hearing for years that America is highly divided. We also have been hearing for years, for longer actually, that Americans generally distrust politics. What are we to make of that? Well, one, polling on issues that people know little about creates an illusion of public opinion and an illusion of public partisanship. I'm going to mention the latter on partisanship first, and I'm going to go to a normal bourgeois source for that. We're going to talk about a book called The Other Divide by Krupnikov and Ryan. Yana Krupnikov and John Barry Ryan. I'm going to link a podcast to discuss this from the 538 blog. You can't get a whole lot more mainstream than that. And what we'll notice here is that the opinion of partisanship is created by polling and by social media siloing. So most people who encounter the opposite political team now because people are more sorted by class and regional interests than ever before. People think this is being driven by political division, but it's actually being driven by economic division. All right. Increasingly educated people have to go into larger and larger cities to find jobs because the kind of jobs that need those specialists are highly centralized in specific cities. The hinterlands of the United States are the periphery, if you want to use systems analysis talk, that is highly resource dependent, is often in the countryside and has completely different economics, declining economics too, actually, because it is dependent on things that don't really get rents. Now, what's interesting about this is the voter base is, in general, and this is confirmed by many studies, for the GOP, of the highly politically activated, is really a petite bourgeois class of between $80,000 and $200,000 earning. Many of them are small business owners. Many of them are better off employees in those same regions. Okay, but what do we make of that? Well, Krinikov and Ryan point out that if we ask the questions differently, we see that only about 20% of the population is highly ideologically motivated. They might have opinions on different issues, but they're too busy to develop their own real opinion. And in fact, this is also tied to work. Now, this is not tied to income. This is tied to one's ability to be a work and have a family, etc. So the more politically active one is, the less likely one is actually to be in the part of their life where they have a lot of children. And thus, they outsource most of their leisure time to the raising of kids and to the maintenance of their job. These people, by and large, actually are the 80%, according to Kruvnikov and Ryan, who are slightly less educated. They tend to go to state schools when they go to college, if they go to college at all. They don't tend to go to elite liberal arts institutions, etc. And they don't tend to have time to be highly interactive with either the news or with Twitter or Facebook. People who are highly interacted only really encounter people who share different opinions for them on Twitter and Facebook, and often in opinions that are stated in hyperbolic ways for spreading, paranoid messages on that medium. The kind of people that would be into this. But what you find when you ask questions, and the answers to these questions vary greatly, even amongst partisans, on what the answer will be. So Krumnikova and Ryan point out that if you, in an interview with 538, that if you ask people how they felt about January 6th, and you mention to those same people that there were riots in major cities in regards to Black Lives Matter, first, their approval rate of January 6th goes from 25% to 5%. Now, what does this tell you? That most people are not highly invested and are reacting to priming. All right. Now, this is where my Marxist mind comes in. Right. Who has the leisure time to be highly invested in politics, and what aren't they doing? This means, by the way, and I've been trying to imply this even though this does not come up in this research, that the working class is the least likely group of people to be highly politically motivated. They frankly don't have the time. And when they do have the time, they tend to be in specific regions with specific interests. All right. Coastal elite cities, which make up the majority of Democratic opinions, are also tied into industries that are aligned to the Democrats. Also, the rich who live in these areas can pay the high local taxes and don't really care. They get the social benefits of those taxes in kind. So it's even a rational trade-off for them. But that doesn't actually apply to all the other parties involved. This is something that Michael Lind and from a kind of centrist conservative point of view, and and Phil A. Neal, from a left point of view, have shut out a large part of the country and large social classes from the discourse. Now, this brings me to a fair article, whose title I kind of ripped off in the beginning here. Polling creates issues people know very little. Polling on issues that people know very little about creates the illusion of public opinion. Now, this is an article by David W. Moore, which points out that the presidential approval rating was created in 1938 by George Gallup when he launched a newspaper column called America Speaks. For 7+ decades, Gallup has been the primary people who gathered this data. I'm going to come back to this in a minute, and it ties to the 20% thing I was just mentioning. Writing in Public Opinion Quarterly, the general approval correlates moderately with how well a president is doing when running for re-election and how the party fares in the midterms. While presidential approval ratings provide relevant insight into public opinion, the same cannot be said for presidential approval questions that focus on individual issues. And I actually ignore a lot of individual issue questions. If we take the questions at face value, the results present an amazing picture of the American public. Here are 9 very different, complicated questions, and the 9s are rebuilding America's infrastructure, response to COVID-19, climate change, economic recovery, situation we're working with Russia and Ukraine, immigration, crime, gun violence, and inflation. For each one, respondents are asked how well Biden is doing. The number indicates that 97% or more of Americans know what Biden is doing for each of these issues in detail, and presumably, after careful thought, have come to a meaningful opinion as to whether or not they approve or disapprove of his actions. This is a media polling myth of the American electorate, fully informed and attentive to issues with well-considered views about the way they should be addressed. The myth bears little resemblance to reality. In fact, on most issues, the vast majority of the public is simply uninformed, or if they're highly politically motivated, probably selectively are misinformed. And that's my caveat. And about these issues, especially about what the president is doing on these issues. This creates an illusion on public opinion. This is why for both Chomsky and David Horowitz can cite public opinion polls for why conservatives or progressives should win at any given moment. But what opinion polls do tell us much more clearly is what political factions are popular as they're broadly understood within the country, not on issues in which people are generally poorly aware. And in fact, if I am obvious, I often find even the highly politically motivated people who come and watch this are not very aware neither of world situations or of what other people actually think, because most of their news sources are highly siloed on the internet, geared towards maintaining their views and telling them what they want to hear. The internet by itself is a cognitive bias machine. But this brings me back to another point. The progressive left, according to Pew Research Center, and a massive undertaking they did in 2001 called the political typology, and their response on this, which goes into what these mean. The progressive left is only 6% of the population, where establishment liberals are 13%. Mainstay Democrats, who are not particularly motivated, particularly on hot button issues, are about 16%, and the outsider left, which would be any number of things, because of the overlap between the progressive left and some of this, is 10%. Although the outsider left is often listed as either single issue or moderates, and that's not really true. The graphic given on the Pew that you'll see here, I'm not going to flash it up for you, is kind of misleading. Stressed sideliners make up 15%, and then committed Republicans, aka faith and flag conservatives and committed conservatives, are about 70%, with the populist right being another 11%. Now, that's of adult respondents conducted over a 10-day period in 2001. We can go into the nitty-gritty details of this, and perhaps we will. But one thing we can see in the breakdown that they did on this, which is beyond red and blue, the political typology, that opinions, Democratic pathology groups say a lot more needs to be done on racial bias, but differ on the need for systemic change. GOP says little needs to be done, for example. You look at this and the other. But one of the things is the progressives aren't who they think they are. and that the faith-filled flag conservatives aren't either. But there are the people portrayed in the media, and they are the people most likely to be involved in partisan outreach, which roughly corresponds, all right, with the center spectrum, thesis, which is 80% of the population or more, as well as the thesis given by Yanikoff and Ryan, that 80% of the population does not actually have as partisan view of politics as we thought, which means not only is it 20% that does have it highly selective and pretty highly educated, they are also polarized amongst themselves, slightly favoring conservatives, even though conservatives are a slightly smaller faction of the overall population. Now you see the problem. And I'm betting that if we have a Republican president, the activated side of extreme politics would change again. As I've said over and over again on live streams, which we're not doing anymore, that during the Obama presidency, there were tons of libertarian podcasts. And as the Obama presidency soured, many of them became nationalists. During the same time period, the end of the Obama presidency, when it was clearer that Hillary Clinton was a nominee and that maybe the Democrats didn't actually have a cakewalk ahead, left podcasts proliferated and then accelerated as a form of outsider media during the Trump presidency. And so I bet we're seeing the reverse trends now. The problem is political institutions often build up around these media spheres and convince themselves that these media spheres and that people and highly motivated younger student activists, and this is for both the left and the right, or older people who are largely outside of the workforce but have leisure time and money, are actually the majority of the population. It is not the case. Any socialist politics needs to not only take these facts into consideration, but to look at them through the lenses of oppression, domination, and exploitation. And what one will find is oppression, domination, and exploitation do not actually translate to having strong opinions about those topics. In fact, having strong opinions about those topics may be a function of one's class in society, where one has the kind of job and is around the kind of people where one can easily have those kinds of opinions without paying high social consequences. And given that we are economically sorted and the economic interests of certain regions are becoming more and more partisanly aligned, it becomes clear what this means. What this does not mean is that you know what the working class really thinks because of a Marxist presupposition. It also doesn't mean that you should ignore bourgeois science because it doesn't conform to your stereotypes of the way things are. One of the things I would like to point out about the Moore article is that polling is actually reliable for approval polls of broad groups and individual politicians. It's not reliable for what people actually think or why people actually think what they think about politics. And frankly, people's regional economic interest is even more predictive than some vague notion of social class, and definitely more predictive than any other factor that we can look at except for education and age. And education and age are also correlative to region where one lives and what one's function in the economy are. Start thinking clearly. Always remember this. Don't turn around and ignore facts from general political science because it doesn't confirm your worldview. Definitely don't do that because it meets some kind of projective hypothesis you have about what kind of answer you have to a very abstract socialist question. We'll talk more about what this has to do with socialism in the future, but this is a basic thing that one should understand.